Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day. I'm joined, as I am every week, by Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, welcome back for this week's Libertarian Angle.
Hey, it's great to be back here with our viewers and audiences, and you too.
Oh, well, thank you very much. That's very nice of you to remember that. I think that's the first time you've actually said that.
And the last.
All right, good to have you back. And, this is September 13th, 2 days after the 15th anniversary of the 9/11 event. So I thought, well, we ought to address that. And we've been addressing it ever since 9/11. That was back when you were Vice President of Academic Affairs for the Future of Freedom Foundation. And we were one of the first ones that were coming out talking about foreign policy at that time.
Yes.
In fact, I think it was within a couple of weeks that I remember I published an op-ed that said, is it too soon to examine foreign policy? And I'm sure you'll recall this also, Richard, that we were just inundated with hate mail. I mean, I've never seen anything like it before in my life, accusing us of hating America and being unpatriotic and traitors and loving terrorists, and all this because we pointed out the role that U.S. foreign policy had played in motivating the 9/11 attackers. As you'll recall, President Bush had come out with a statement, and he was immediately joined by officials of the national security establishment, the Pentagon, the CIA, saying that the reason the attackers had attacked was because they just hate America for its freedom and values. And so that this was now going to be a war on terrorism that was going to last forever because these people just hate us for our freedom and values and would for the rest of their lives. So we pointed out, no, that's simply not the case. In fact, it was a direct lie. That what had happened was that the U.S., after it lost its official Cold War enemy, the Soviet Union and communism, with the demise of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Empire, that they were panicking. People were talking about a peace dividend. Libertarians were talking about, well, what do we need the national security state anymore? It was brought into existence because of the Cold War. Now the Cold War is over. Why do we need it? Why do we need NATO? And so that motivated the national security state to go into the Middle East, start poking hornets' nests. You've got the Persian Gulf intervention without a declaration of war. They had the brutal sanctions against the Iraqi people, which were killing hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children. This was throughout the 90s. You got Madeleine Albright's infamous statement where she said that the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children were worth it. And by it, she meant regime change in Iraq, where Saddam Hussein would leave power and a U.S. installed ruler would be replacing him. And then you had the no-fly zones that were killing people, including children. You had stationing of U.S. troops on Islamic holy lands. The unconditional support to the Israeli government. So all of this was just causing a boiling cauldron in the Middle East. And so there was terrorist attacks in 1993 at the World Trade Center. There was also one at the USS Cole, the U.S. embassies in East Africa. And every time these terrorists were saying, it's because of what you're doing here in the Middle East. You're killing these children. You've got these troops stationed over here. I mean, they kept telling the U.S. this is what is motivating our anger, and there was anger and rage, not just among the terrorists, but among regular people in the Middle East. Two high UN officials, Hans von Sponeck and Dennis Halliday, even resigned their positions as humanitarian directors there at the UN because of what they call genocide of the Iraqi children. So I don't know if you recall this, but we were publishing some op-eds before 9/11 that said if you don't stop doing this, you're going to see major terrorist attack on American soil. And we weren't the only ones. Chalmers Johnson, the former CIA consultant, was saying the same thing in his book Blowback. But then the 9/11 attacks come and we point all this out and people go ballistic and say, oh, you hate America. It's really that they hate us for our freedom and values. And the worst part of it, Richard, is they end up doubling down and end up doing the exact same things that they were doing before. They invade Afghanistan for a regime change operation. They invade Iraq to achieve what the sanctions had not been able to achieve. And they generate in the process what I call the biggest terrorist-producing machine in history. So why don't you take it from there? I know you wrote a great piece, or you answered some questions from the Christian Science Monitor that you wrote about this week on an article that we published on our website. A fantastic article that goes back to that period of time. Why don't you remind us what your perspective was at that time?
Well, I'd like to step back a little bit before I actually talk about that and sort of amplify some themes that you've brought up, and that is that this policy of the United States that has involved all of these some intended and a lot of unintended consequences in the Middle East in the last, let's say, decade and a half, has its origin in the emergence of the United States as a global policeman in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. Franklin Roosevelt actively attempted to get the United States into the war. Obviously, America's participation in the Second World War and any challenge to that participation is still heavily controversial. But even separate from that, from 1945, 1946 on, beginning with the Harry Truman administration, going through Dwight Eisenhower and then JFK, and then Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon and so on, and now to the present, it has been the implicit and often explicit view of the foreign policy decision makers in Washington, D.C., regardless of political party affiliation, that it is the responsibility, the duty, and even more the right of the United States to militarily and politically intervene in virtually anywhere and any part of the world where those in the decision-making roles in Washington view it to be somehow in the national interest of the United States or to be serving global peace, harmony, and freedom. Basically, the United States has taken over being the gendarme of the planet Earth in many instances over the last 70-odd years now. Now, given this mindset, it is inevitable that this will involve the United States into conflicts, into controversies, into wars that entangle the U.S. into its own military involvement, into the loss of American lives, and into making situations that often were terrible in these other parts of the world, but far worse. And so in that context, let me sort of mention some of the things that I brought up in this sort of symposium that I participated in on the online version of the Christian Science Monitor back at the beginning of October 2001. The 9/11 tragedy had occurred, and it was a tragedy. The fact is you had these religious fanatics who commandeered by force several civilian airlines and proceeded to smash them into the World Trade Towers and into the Pentagon. And 3,000 lives were lost, or nearly 3,000 lives were lost in the Trade Towers. These were innocent men, women, and children going about their daily affairs and business and activities, thousands more injured. This was a heinous attack. Even whatever you may feel against the United States government, it should not be the retribution act of anyone to focus their wrath against innocent human beings. Certainly the very point that you were pointing out, Jacob, that the United States intervenes, and however they may be going after Osama bin Laden or Saddam Hussein, the collateral damage, to use the euphemism, ends up falling upon multitudes of innocent men, women, and children who have nothing to do with the political decisions or activities of the Saddam Husseins or the Osama bin Ladens of the Middle East. The same surely symmetrically applies that no matter what the anger and resentments against the United States government for intervening in the Middle East had nothing to do with the innocent lives lost in the trade towers. Really, if we're going to be ethically symmetrical, that holds. And that was a terrible tragedy for that reason. But the fact is that what was the immediate response of the U.S. government? Did it rethink why did this come about? But precisely as you said, the response was, you see, what could we have done to make them angry at us? What have we? What offense have we undertaken? We're the friends of freedom. We're concerned with peace around the world. If we're there, it's because it's good for us and everybody else. They cannot understand the mindset of both crazies, but also normal people in other parts of the world who resent, are angry, who desire for the United States not to be interfering politically, economically, through government foreign aid and so on, and militarily in the internal affairs of their societies, their countries, or influencing their governments. The fact is that I pointed out in that symposium in the Christian Science Monitor and other places, including the articles that you and I were writing in Freedom Daily both before and after 9/11, is that when the United States intervenes anywhere in the world, it inevitably must pick sides. It supports this government versus some opposition group or some opposition faction as opposed to some other opposition faction. And there's the old adage, the friend of my enemy is my enemy. By the United States supporting any side in these foreign countries, it inevitably makes us the enemy and the target of those who are the opponents or the enemies or the resistors against the government or the group that we're supporting. We put American soldiers in harm's way by interfering into these internal affairs. Now, even in the most generous interpretation, in my opinion, the fact remains is that the vast majority of these conflicts and controversies and political upheavals and civil wars and other parts of the world have nothing to do with the United States. We might not like the ideology of one side or the other. We might not like the policies that some government undertakes in another part of the world, and they can be horrendous and cruel and dictatorial and brutal. But it is not concerning the direct and immediate protection of the life, liberty, and property of the American citizenry within the territory of the United States, which is the only valid justification for American national defense responses, not intervening in other foreign affairs. But by doing so, we arouse the anger, resentment, and wrath of those who oppose the groups or the governments we're supporting. And particularly when we militarily intervene, we put our soldiers in harm's way. Now, one of the things that I said in this symposium, which I don't think anyone else picked up on to say at the time, is that shortly after 9/11, George W. Bush spoke before a joint House of Congress and to the American people, obviously, about this tragedy. And he said at one point is that bounties were being put on the head of Osama bin Laden, wanted, and he reminded Americans of the old Western poster, wanted, dead or alive. If it was a bad guy and the local sheriff couldn't easily get him with the posse, then the bounty hunters were set loose and to be brought in, and if he resisted, impossible to get him peacefully, dead, wanted, dead or alive, and you get the bounty. And I said that rather than the United States undertaking what was clearly an imminent invasion of Afghanistan and incurring the risk of thousands of lives, both on the American side and among the innocent population of Afghanistan, and imposing upon the American taxpayers what would inevitably be a vast financial cost of such an intervention, then practice what you preach, Mr. President. Make these huge bounties $500 million, or as I would even revise it today, $1 billion, tax-free in any currency that the winner of the bounty wants, and set loose retired Green Berets, Special Forces, former French foreign legionnaires, mercenaries, risk-taking adventurers who are willing to go into the Afghan badlands and track these people down. The cost to the U.S. government, the risk to innocent Afghani lives and to the servicemen of the United States and the allies that we dragged into this because of the NATO alliance might never have occurred. It took years for both the Bush and the Obama administration to finally track down Osama bin Laden. And not even Afghanistan. They had to interfere into the territorial integrity of a neighboring country, Pakistan, to track him down and kill him. How much money, how many lives, how much infringements on people's life and security and privacy could have been avoided if you just said, wanted, dead or alive? These are a band of ordinary criminals who maybe have fanatical ideas, but they're ordinary criminals. Just set the bounty hunters loose without involving the United States in a massive foreign intervention that is estimated to have cost us $1.6 trillion and cost the lives of well over 2,000 Americans and either tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of innocent Afghani lives, having nothing to do with the Taliban or Al-Qaeda itself. But we chose not to do that. Instead, we chose to follow a path of foreign adventurism. And on matching that, because we're now at war, both in a combat relation in Afghanistan and with terrorism, we introduced the Department of Homeland Security, National Security, the anti-terrorism state, in which under that justification and rationale, we suddenly have the U.S. government intruding, violating, surveillancing into every little corner and cranny of our lives in principle, if they consider it necessary to keep America safe. Are there bad people in the world? Yes. Are there kooks and nuts, either secular or theological, who might be guided to do bad things to Americans? Of course. We live in that kind of world and always have. But by following this path, we have done more to threaten the security of American lives and to bring down a rationale for the violation and weakening of American liberty in the name of keeping us safe and free. That has been the disaster and the terrible intended and, most importantly, unintended consequences that have followed from the tragedy of 9/11 and then the invasion of Afghanistan that the government undertook following that.
Yeah, let me start with where you started out with respect to the rise of the national security state after World War II. I mean, here was the justification for this was, of course, that America's partner and ally in World War II, the Soviet Union, was now the new official enemy. And the rationale was that we need to become like them in order to defeat them in this Cold War. And so we need this government apparatus, huge standing military establishment, secret intelligence force. The NSA later came into existence, I think it was in 1952, and which bore a lot of the characteristics of totalitarian regimes. And this was the start of the regime change operations with Iran in 1953 and Guatemala in 1954, and then onward to a number of others, Chile, Indonesia, the Congo. The assassination program began here with the CIA Mafia partnership. It was secret at the time to assassinate Fidel Castro. And then later the CIA's partnership in Operation Condor, which had been put together by Pinochet, who the CIA and the military had installed there in Chile. So you have this major change that President Eisenhower, who knew a lot about military establishments, was talking about when in his farewell address, when he was warning the American people against this military-industrial complex and how it posed a threat to our democratic processes and our liberties. And so let me put it in a larger context of how different this was from the founding principles of America. That you have John Quincy Adams in his speech to Congress in the 4th of July, 1821, where he says, America does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. And he was talking about the kind of things that you were referring to, that there's a lot of bad things that happen around the world. You've got tyrannies, dictatorships, famines, starvation, discord, civil wars, regular wars. But he said the role of the federal government of the United States is not to go abroad and slay those monsters and save people from them. Instead, America would establish a free society, a peaceful society, a prosperous society here at home, and to serve as a model for the world and to serve as a sanctuary for people who were fleeing these monsters. And he was drawing also on the ideas of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson that said no alliances with other countries. no bitter enmity directed toward any particular countries. And we extend our hand in friendship with commerce. He's talking about the private sector. But we had a limited government republic with no big military establishment like we have today, no foreign empire of military bases, no foreign interventionism. Well, that all changed, and then we reaped the results. And Adams has said, if America ever changes direction, you will see a dictatress arising in Washington, D.C. And so now you have this government that bears all the marks of a dictatorship. I mean, there's no other way to explain it. You've got a government that has the power to assassinate Americans with the approval of the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary, the power to round up Americans and put them into concentration camps, the power to torture them, the power to indefinitely detain them for a life sentence with no trial, no due process of law. This is all contrary, needless to say, to the principles of a free society. And then you've got the out-of-control spending, the debt, the mountain of debt. You've got the Federal Reserve accommodating the debt with decade after decade of inflation. This is really a bad situation, and this is what the abandonment of those founding principles has brought us, the surveillance state, all the secret surveillance of Americans and so forth. And it's all justified in the name of keeping us safe from the very enemies that they themselves produce with their interventionist foreign policy. So really, Richard, the answer is there. We were saying it back on the 9/11, 2001. Bring the troops home. Don't send them abroad to do more of it, like they did with Afghanistan, Iraq, and like they're doing today. Bring them home, discharge them. And then I say start raising people's vision to a higher level, and that is restore a republic to our land by dismantling this Cold War era dinosaur organization called the National Security Establishment, along with its correlative cousin, NATO. Then you're talking about achieving a free, prosperous, and harmonious society once again.
Yeah, let me sort of complement this, if I can put on my sort of Austrian economist hat, and that is there's an arrogance and a hubris, and to use the title of Friedrich Hayek's Nobel lecture, a pretense of knowledge on the part of those in Washington D.C. They believe, with the same arrogance as they try to micromanage and regulate and control U.S. social and economic affairs, that they know how the world should be managed, directed, designed, and ordered. They're going to go into a country thousands of miles away, and they're going to know how to restructure the society, reform the government, give them a constitution, teach them how to live like Americans, and everything will be fine. If they can't even manage their own house without causing the corruptions and the inefficiencies and the lacks of freedom and the disorder that we see with the interventionist welfare state at home, what type of arrogance and hubris is on these people's part to think that they know enough to micromanage the redesign of societies and peoples and social orders in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, or anywhere else that the United States puts its finger into other people's affairs. This is a dangerous thing. You know, Friedrich Hayek emphasized that one of the most important uses of reason as man's greatest tool to master and the world and be able to manage his affairs is to understand the limits of his own reason, what he can't do as well as what he can do. And it is not in the power of governments to centrally plan the remaking of any part of the globe or the globe as a whole. And that is what is an essential error and fallacy and danger in the mindset of these people in Washington, D.C., who have acted on the basis of the social engineering mentality since 1945.
Yeah, and let me go back to this point you were making about the bounty for bin Laden, because at the time, people were saying that libertarians are impractical, you're not going to invade Afghanistan, you're going to just let them get away with this. Well, let's keep in mind that the reason that Bush invaded Afghanistan was not because the Afghan Taliban government was complicit in the 9/11 attacks. He invaded because he had made an unconditional extradition demand. He said, you deliver bin Laden over to us, period. And their response was, well, first of all, there was no extradition treaty, and this was a criminal offense. It's in the U.S. Code. Terrorism is a criminal offense. It's always been. That's why there's terrorist prosecutions in U.S. federal court. There was no extradition treaty, but the Taliban government said, if you'll give us evidence that would be sufficient in an extradition hearing, we will look at that evidence, and if it's sufficient, we'll turn him over to an independent third nation for a trial. Bush said, no, unconditional. You deliver him, extradition treaty or not, or we invade. And so the invasion took place. Well, we were saying at the time, Richard, that if you offered this bounty, bin Laden would have been isolated. He certainly couldn't travel around freely anymore. So his ability to do harm would be extremely limited. Very difficult to talk on cell phones because you'd have all these mercenaries out there looking for him to get this large bounty. But you wouldn't have killed all of these Afghan people. Well, you wouldn't have sacrificed American troops. But I'd venture to say that 99% of the people they have killed in Afghanistan had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11. I mean, all the wedding parties they bombed, all the regular people that have lost their lives in this conflict, and most of the people they're fighting them now had nothing to do with 9/11. They just don't like a foreign intruder in their country, just like they didn't like the Soviet Union when it was intruding. So if we move forward, I think your point about hubris is so right on, that these people have this arrogance that we're going to impose America's way of life here in these countries, our values, when all that does is build resentment. Nobody likes that kind of a Badinsky, especially when it's a deadly and destructive Badinsky. But finally, Richard, they use this as the excuse to take away our freedoms here at home. And this is what Eisenhower was saying, is that this military-industrial complex, the whole thing, the Congress, he was going to even call it the military-industrial congressional complex, the NSA, the Pentagon, the CIA, they use this ongoing crisis, this perpetual war on terrorism, which their interventionism is generating, to take away our freedoms here at home. And that's why people that say, well, we live in an unsafe world, Jacob, we need to have this huge military establishment because there's a lot of unsafe things like ISIS and so forth. Well, all they're doing is choosing the concept of safety over liberty, because you cannot be free as long as this type of junk is going on. The only way to establish a free society is by bringing these troops home, limiting them to genuine defense. But since none of those groups, those terrorist groups, are going to come and invade the United States and conquer the United States, you really don't need this huge military empire. What you really need for a free society is a constitutionally limited republic, the same thing the Founding Fathers brought into existence with the Constitution.
Absolutely right.
So on that note, we're about out of time. We'll wrap it up. Richard, enjoyed the conversation with you as always.
Until next time, and thank you to the viewers and listeners for sharing their time with us.
Yep, we'll see you next week.